in Moodle. So again, I apologize for going through this stuff so quickly, but
we don't have the time.
we don't have the time. Yeah.
This is why 8-week classes.
This is right. Yeah, this is the issue with 8-week classes for sure.
I don't know why people thought it was a good idea. It really isn't.
Well, it does keep people on task, and it does move you through a class faster. So, I mean, I see arguments from both sides. But here we go. Articles of Confederation. All right. So what are the Articles of Confederation? So the Articles of Confederation, yeah, you want to tell us, Christian?
The first federal governmental body structure of the United States of America. So it's more of a loose confederation of, it's more like a boy Roman Empire in the sense that it was like this 12 states all united together with people that they really did not like.
Okay. So Articles of Confederation, Christian said, is the first government structure. That is true. It basically is, this predates the Constitution that we have today, right? So the Articles of Confederation basically held together. They are a confederation. They establish a confederation that is, hold on, I've got to let somebody in the class.
Most of you probably know this stuff, but technology to get things across, so that's fine.
Yeah.
My opinion, the only reason it didn't work out so well was because the technology they had at the time was humans compared to.
Could be, but it is basically the first government structure that holds us together that predates the Constitution. Yeah. And so it essentially creates a unicameral legislature. So one body, each state gets one vote. All right. We're talking about a very weak central government here, guys. Very weak central government. In fact, they established what they called, and this I'm quoting from the articles themselves, and if I had time, I would pull them up. But you can look them up if you like. They established what's called a League of Friendship. A League of Friendship. Now, what we have to remember about the Articles of Confederation is we have just gotten out of a war in which Americans saw the British as tyrannical. They saw the British as having this strong, centralized power that had created all of these problems in the first place. So what they're really trying to do here is they're trying to avoid anything that looks British. They're trying to avoid anything that looks like centralized power that can create tyranny. All right. So that's what we always have to keep in mind when we're looking at the Articles of Confederation. All right. So that's why they use this language like League of Friendship. It is full state sovereignty. All right. So the states have the power. All right. Not any type of federal government. All right. So I often compare this to the Europe. It's like the European Union. Similar to the European Union in that, you know, today Germany and France are their own countries, but, you know, they also have, they come together to create trade deals, and they come together to have the same money and that sort of thing. So, so similar in that way, in that the states have sovereignty. I mean, in fact, it's not going to be until the War of 1812. We always refer to the United States of America not as a country, right? It is United States, plural, United States of America, right? Each individual state is essentially its own country. And that is what the Articles of Confederation are really good at doing. And this is what the colonists want out of these Articles of Confederation. It took 9 of 13 people to enact the law, right? So 9 of 13 votes to enact the law. If you wanted to amend the articles, you had to have 13 of 13 to amend the articles. So, I mean, again, they're trying to make it here so that there's no federal entity that can impose its will on the states themselves. And they're very, very, very worried about that, I guess you could say. All right. Now, this structure does not have the power to tax. It can ask to tax, like it can ask for taxes from states, but there's no centralized authority to really require that. All right. So, it's funny because I've had students before who've said, well, under the Articles, we actually had several presidents before George Washington. That is true. We had presidents under the Articles of Confederation, but the Articles of Confederation is so weak that you really couldn't even call these people presidents. They were basically like committee chairs, because this structure is just entirely weak. It's supposed to be extremely weak, right? What type of powers do they have? Well, they can make treaties. So let me write a couple powers here down. Powers: make treaties, they can coin money, and they can maintain an army. That's about it. And that's all that they were intended to do. All right, so what happens here? Oh, let me mention one more thing. The other thing we need to know is the Northwest Ordinance. Almost forgot to mention that. So the Articles of Confederation are actually passed alongside of the Northwest Ordinance. And the Northwest Ordinance basically organized the Northwestern territories, like in the Ohio area, that was gained after the American Revolution. And what the Northwest Ordinance basically did was it created a path to statehood. So how is it that we become a state in the future? Well, you have to have 5,000 people or whatever. You have to have, so it created basically the requirements that were needed in order for people to establish a new state and join the Union. All right. It also abolished slavery in the territories. So very, very early on here, we have people in Congress, or people in the Continental Congress, who are really considering doing away with slavery. Like, this is very, very early on. So it abolished slavery in the territories. It also established freedom of religion in the territories, because that was something that was obviously important to them based on what they had been through, right? So those are some of the other items that go along with the Northwest Ordinance, or I'm sorry, with the Articles of Confederation. Northwest Ordinance was passed alongside of it. So, all right, so that is the Articles of Confederation. Now, the problem with the Articles is people immediately start to notice that there are some weaknesses with the Articles of Confederation. All right, now we've talked about how some people intended those weaknesses to be there, right? But others feel like those weaknesses are causing major problems. So what are some weaknesses? Well, one weakness is, how is it that, let's say there is a bridge, people want to build a bridge in Maryland that goes from North Carolina to South Carolina. And how is it that who pays for the bridge if we're going to connect the two states together, all right? And what if there is a dispute between one state to the other, all right? And how do you settle those disputes? So there wasn't really a proper way to adjudicate disputes between states, right? You also had some states who were not using continental money. So they were like, well, let's use continental money. And then some people were like, well, we don't want to use continental money. We trade a lot with Spain. I think it was Georgia that was actually using Spanish pesos. So they're like, well, we prefer to use pesos because we trade a lot more with Florida and the Spanish territory. And so you had the issue of people using different money. So, I mean, think about that today. Like, if you were living in North Carolina and you want to go to South Carolina, and you would have to pay in Palmetto dollars instead of, longleaf pine dollars. Yeah. So there were some basic issues like that. You also had issues of commerce, of people who could use who gets to direct commerce on rivers that go between states. So those were some issues that needed to be essentially ironed out. All right. Another issue that they had, and this was probably the largest issue, becomes the most cited issue, is an idea known as Shays' Rebellion. All right. So this is something you'll need to remember: Shays' Rebellion. So what is Shays' Rebellion? I'll give you the brief on it. So what happens is, after the Revolutionary War, you have a lot of these soldiers who are returning home, all right? And many of these soldiers, they didn't actually get paid, all right? So many of them are not getting paid to fight in the Revolutionary War. Well, they return home. Many of them had loans. When they come back home, all of a sudden, these lenders are going, all right, you need to pay up. We need your money. People like Daniel Shays, who's living in Massachusetts, he's a farmer. Daniel Shays says, well, I can't pay because, I've kind of been fighting in the war for the last several years, and I haven't really been able to run my farm. Well, these foreign countries are demanding payment. So they're like, well, you know what? If you can't pay, then we're going to have to put you in debtor's prison. So Daniel Shays and others decide we're going to lead a revolt. So they go into Massachusetts, they lead a revolt, they lock up courthouses. It's a really big ordeal. And so the problem is, how do we put down a revolt like this? Well, the first obvious answer is, oh, we use the state militia. So Massachusetts calls on the state militia. Well, guess what? Daniel Shays is part of the state militia, and a lot of his goons, a lot of his rebel rousers, they're also part of the state militia. So it's like, well, we can't do that. Oh, let's call on the federal government. Oh, wait, the federal government doesn't really have an army. Oh, we have to go and ask all of the states if they would be willing to send in troops to help put down the rebellion. So this becomes a really big talking point at the Constitutional Convention, is Shays' Rebellion. And how is it that we expediently, people like Alexander Hamilton are really pushing this. How is it that we expediently put down rebellions if we don't even have an army, a national army that can deal with these types of situations, right? So Daniel Shays, remember that. It's a big flashpoint to what's coming. So what's coming?
George Washington.
What's coming is a constitutional convention. Right? Now, keep in mind, the Constitutional Convention is simply intended to revise the Articles of Confederation. Right? I'm just going to put Articles of Confederation. There we go. So that's all that's supposed to happen at the Constitutional Convention. We're just supposed to revise the Articles of Confederation, iron out some of these problems. If we need to make the government a little bit stronger, then we can certainly do that. Unfortunately, fortunately, unfortunately, depending on who you are, James Madison shows up. He and Washington and Hamilton and others had been meeting and having conversations, and Hamilton's like, let's create something new. Let's create something entirely new. All right. So what ends up happening is James Madison comes to the Constitutional Convention and he rolls out, I've got a plan. It's called the Virginia Plan. All right. So if there's anything that you guys can learn from James Madison moving forward in your careers, is that if you ever go to a meeting and you have an initial idea at the meeting, then you typically run the meeting. And that's essentially what happens from here on out, because Madison comes to this meeting and he says, guess what, guys? I've got a whole new plan. It's called the Virginia Plan because I'm from Virginia. And this Virginia Plan is going to lay out a new government. This angers a lot of people and, of course, makes some people happy.
And angers a lot of people because it's based on population rather than statehood itself.
Well, it angers a lot of people. It angers a lot of people because it is creating something that is very strong and in some sense removed from the people. And so I think that's, and I'll get into that in just a moment, but it does create, so here are the key factors of the Virginia Plan. First of all, it's going to have 3 branches of government. So I should have put that first. And it's going to create a strong federal government too, by the way. 3 branches of government. This is going to be a really strong centralized power. And it's also going to have a bicameral legislature, which basically means that there are 2 houses, right? So upper So basically, this is basically, look, this is modeled off of the British example, right? And so that's why some people were mad, because this was like, oh, we're going right back to the British. So House of Commons, House of Lords. So upper house and the lower house. And in fact, in Philadelphia, they actually had, where the Capitol was located, Independence Hall, there was an upper house and a lower house, and the people in the top were the senators. They would stay in the top. It was usually a little bit nicer, and the lower house just had all the House of Representatives, and wasn't quite as comfortable, cushy. So it's going to have a bicameral legislature, upper house, lower. Those are the main points I just want you to remember. And it's, of course, I mentioned the president. It's going to have a judiciary, Supreme Court. And guess what? As you all figured out, like I said, Madison's plan is going to stick, and it's going to be what we're going to be working off of. It's going to be the working model, and people are just going to simply be wanting to amend that model. So what we end up getting next is something known as the New Jersey plan. All right. So the New Jersey plan, I believe it was introduced by Patterson from New Jersey. And essentially the New Jersey plan is going to have a unicameral legislature. So one house, right, not two. It will have a president. It agreed with having the judiciary as well, except the unicameral legislature is basically going to be one vote per state. All right. So all the New Jersey plan essentially ends up being is the Articles of Confederation with kind of a steroid injection. All right. So that's basically the New Jersey plan. All right. Articles of Confederation. These are the people who like the Articles of Confederation. Right. They're like, hey, let's just make the articles stronger. And to the point of many people who supported the New Jersey plan, that was the original intention of the convention. The original intention of the convention was to revise the articles. All right. Go ahead.
Unless states like New Jersey with a lesser population, probably if they went with the Virginia plan, that they would just get outvoted by the wealthier and more populated states. That doesn't happen today, right? With California, New York, and most other states like that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
It does really happen today, though.
Yeah, well, so I think that's the key feature of having a Senate, is it allows those smaller states more power.
I know, I was just saying, like,
yeah.
I was just thinking sarcastic, like, glad the larger states can't buy out the smaller
yeah. Well, if it was based on population, you're exactly right, Christian. California, New York, even North Carolina, I think, is in the top 10 largest populations. You would have just several states who would essentially run the country. So yeah, so we're going to have Christian mentioned here, New Jersey is a smaller state. People are like, look, if you base in this bicameral legislature, one thing I failed to mention is the bicameral legislature, the houses are going to be based upon population, right? So however many people you have, that's how many representatives you get to send. People who were kind of in between the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan were like, well, look, if you're going to do this, then basically Pennsylvania and Virginia are going to run the country, because they're going to have the largest population, and they could essentially team up. Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania could team up and basically squash any other ideas that come out of the smaller states. So, of course, ironically, I think New Jersey's like in the top 15 states today. So today they probably wouldn't have liked their own plan. But at any rate, we end up getting the Great Compromise. So remember this, Great Compromise. So the Great Compromise is going to be, we're going to stick with the Virginia plan, but the Virginia plan is now going to have a bicameral ledge, and we're going to have a upper house. So I'm just going to go ahead and call it the Senate. All right, Senate. The Senate is based on, let me just say 2 senators. How about that? 2 senators for each state. And we'll have the House of Representatives that's going to have be based upon population. And so the other piece here, guys, to remember with the legislative branch is we're also adding in an element of aristocracy. All right. So Madison really wants to keep this connected to the people. All right. But with the addition of the Senate, now we have an element of aristocracy because these people are also going to be voted not by the people, but they'll be voted on the state legislatures. And that's going to last all the way up until the 20th century. And so each state legislator will select those people. All right. And, we'll talk more about this later, but there was a fear by a number of people in the Constitutional Convention that if you gave too much power to the people, that it would be tyranny of the masses. Yeah, it would result in anarchy. You would have, because the idea going all the way back to the Greeks was that typically people are selfish. They'll vote for what they want. The poor people will try to take from the rich will try to take from the poor, and it's going to end up resulting in anarchy. All right. True. So we end up getting a Senate that is, senators today, they serve 6-year terms, right? House of Representatives, they serve 2-year terms. The whole purpose of that is so that senators can make appropriate decisions without having to be pressured by their voting population, because it's like, oh, I still got 5 more years till I have to run for election again. They'll forget about that, right? So you want to try to insulate. So the Senate is sort of insulated from the people. The House of Representatives is directly connected to the people and can respond quickly to the people. At least this is the theory, right? When we're creating the Constitutional Convention, right? So remember that Great Compromise. The Great Compromise was done just for that very thing, right? All right, the other compromise too that I'm not going to go into was there was another compromise. It's called the 3/5 compromise, in which the southern states are going to count their slave population for voting purposes. All right, so that was another important compromise, was the 3/5 compromise. And 3/5 compromise was actually introduced by northern states. I think it was Pennsylvania. And so this was actually spearheaded kind of by abolitionists, because the idea is that we don't want their slaves being counted one for one like regular citizens are, because if that's the case, they'll get more people in the House of Representatives and they can have more power. All right. So that was another compromise. Now we're moving on to the ratification. So let me talk now about ratification of the Constitution. All right, so here's what we end up getting. We get 2 camps of people. We get people known as Federalists, all right, pro-Constitution, and we get anti-Federalists. And as you can tell by the name, they are you can just remember anti-federal government, all right? They were against the Constitution. All right. Do what? Real creative naming, yeah. So that's the way you can kind of remember that, is the Federalists, they wanted a stronger power. They wanted more centralized power. The anti-Federalists, they want less centralized power. Many of them actually are for the Articles. Like, they just want to keep the Articles the way they are. You have others who want Patterson's plan. They want the New Jersey plan. So, there's actually a range of anti-Federalists. So the anti-Federalists, they actually take to the newspapers and they start creating what's known as the anti-Federalist papers, right? And they actually use pseudonyms like Brutus, for example, who famously stabbed Julius Caesar in the back, right? And they basically talk about, and they're trying to convince the public how this Constitution is essentially going to take power away from the states. And over time, it's going to take power away from the people. And they're trying to convince people that we do not need a Constitution, that James Madison and the Virginia Plan is crazy. It's madness to even consider that. Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. He was an outspoken anti-federalist, and he was one of these who was really concerned with giving more power to a federal entity, to a large government, right? And in response to that, we actually get what's known as the Federalist Papers. Federalist Papers are written by, they've become very famous. In fact, probably the most significant pieces of political theory that we ever have written for today, and for American political theory at least. The Federalist Papers, they're written by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. And what Madison and Hamilton are trying to do is they're trying to convince people through the newspapers that, look, the Constitution is not this big scary thing that you think it is, and this is why you need to adopt the Constitution. Right? These are the types of things you have. And so when anti-federalists would write something, they would write in response to that, and they would say, no, that's not true. The anti-federalists are misguiding you. This is why this will work. All right, this is how this works, and this is why this will work. All right, so it's essentially a large collection of papers that they're using to convince people that the Constitution is not something that's big and scary. All right. Now, today, we actually use the Federalist Papers. Judges use the Federalist Papers when they want to think about a particular law, when they want to think about, how is it that the founders intended for this to be. They'll go back to the Federalist Papers. So the Federalist Papers today, for our Constitution, they're very important documents, and they help guide legal decisions. But in the time period, they're basically just used to convince people to vote on the Constitution, right? So, all right, so that is the Federalist Papers. And as you all know, the Constitution is now going to be amended, is going to be drafted. But wait, some of the more moderate anti-federalists say, we'll vote on the Constitution, but we need to have some safeguards. We need to have some provisions, all right? And those provisions are, we end up getting what's known as the Bill of Rights, all right? So your first 10 amendments to the Constitution convince, you need to be able to explicitly tell me as a citizen that I have the right to say what I want to. I have the right to, carry a weapon, or I have the right to do these things, right? I have rights for people not to come into my home and search me illegally. So the Bill of Rights basically lay those ideas out in front, right? So the Bill of Rights convince some anti-federalists to vote on the Constitution. I do want to stress, guys, oftentimes historians, when they present the Constitution, it is in a way that talks about how weak the Articles of Confederation are, but I do want to make it clear that there are many people who like that weakness and want to keep that weakness, right? But they end up voting on the Bill of Rights. There are actually a lot of anti-federalists in states like New York and North Carolina was actually a hotbed for anti-federalists. So
because North Carolina hated decentralized authority.
Probably so.
Before the revolution, burned down the governor's palace.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
He really did not like authority.
Yeah. So at any rate, we've now got a Constitution, and we've got a president, George